You were once that kid, stuck in the back seat on the family road trip. Before 1989, that time was yours to endure. Fields for miles. You stared at the back of the seat, your parents talking about something you don't care about. An hour gone. 2 more to go. Then a gray brick appeared in your hands. It had 2 buttons and a cross-shaped pad under your left thumb. A small green tinted screen flickered on, and a Nintendo logo appeared on the screen. Suddenly, the fields were gone. The car was gone. Your parents' conversation was gone. And the back seat became a destination, not a distraction. Not background noise like the radio your parents controlled. A place you could go. Actively, with your hands and your mind engaged simultaneously. And once you'd had it, the world without it was always going to feel just slightly like something was missing. That's what the Game Boy took from you. It was deliberate, built that way on purpose, by a man who understood boredom better than almost anyone. Gunpei Yokoi joined Nintendo in 1965 as a maintenance worker on a playing card assembly line. He wasn't hired to design anything. He wasn't a game designer or an engineer of note or someone with a vision for the future of entertainment. He fixed machines. But Yokoi was the kind of person who couldn't stop noticing things. One afternoon in the late 1970s, riding the Shinkansen bullet train, he watched a bored salaryman in the seat across from him. The man wasn't reading or sleeping. He was pressing the buttons of his LCD calculator. Not calculating anything, just pressing them. Rhythmically, absent-mindedly. The way you do when your hands need something to do and there's nothing to do. Yokoi watched him for a while. And then he had a thought so simple it was almost embarrassing. People want something to do with their hands when there's nothing to do. That observation became the Game & Watch in 1980, a series of small LCD games, 1 game per device, slim enough to fit in a jacket pocket. They sold 40 million units. Yokoi had proven something important. Portability mattered more than power. A modest game you always had with you was worth more than a spectacular one waiting at home. But the Game & Watch had a ceiling, and Yokoi knew it. Each device played exactly 1 game. Master it, and the device became useless. The hardware outlasted its own entertainment value. The question was how to remove that ceiling. And the answer came not from engineering, but from watching his colleagues down the hall. By the mid-1980s, Nintendo's home console, the Famicom in Japan, released in the West as the Nintendo Entertainment System, had already changed what people expected from a games machine. The NES's defining insight wasn't its hardware, it was the cartridge. A self-contained game slotted in and out, turning a single device into a platform for an unlimited library. You didn't buy a new machine for a new game, you bought a new cartridge. The hardware became permanent. The software became infinite. Yokoi looked at the Game & Watch and looked at the NES and asked a question nobody had yet answered. What if you could put the cartridge into the pocket device? Not a shrunken NES. The hardware required for that didn't exist yet and wouldn't have survived on AA batteries anyway. Something new. A purpose-built portable machine with its own architecture, its own constraints, and its own philosophy. But carrying the NES's most important idea, that one device could hold every world you ever wanted to visit, 1 cartridge at a time. That was the Game Boy. The marriage of the Game & Watch's portability with the NES's infinite library built around a philosophy that would define how Yokoi made every decision that followed. Yokoi called his approach lateral thinking with withered technology. The principle was deliberate and counterintuitive. Don't chase the newest, most powerful components. Use mature technology, proven, cheap, well understood, and find new, creative applications for it. The bleeding edge is expensive. It breaks. It drains power. It makes a device fragile and costly. Withered technology does none of those things. Applied to the Game Boy, this philosophy produced a series of decisions that his competitors would spend years mocking and then failing to overcome. The processor was an 8-bit Z80-based chip, not cutting-edge in 1989, but efficient and deeply familiar to developers who'd been building games on similar architecture for years. The more developers understood the hardware, the faster they could build for it, and the richer the game library would become. A better chip with a smaller pool of developers who understood it was a worse platform than a modest chip that every studio already knew how to use. The screen was monochrome, 4 shades of greenish-gray, no backlight, reflective LCD. It ghosted on fast movement and went dark in poor lighting. Yokoi accepted all of this because the screen consumed almost no power and cost almost nothing. Every component that was cheaper or simpler than the alternative was a component that let the battery last longer, and the price stay low enough for a child to own one. 4 AA batteries that provided 15 to 30 hours of play. That was the specification every other decision served. And it was the specification his competitors ignored entirely. Hold a DMG01 and the philosophy becomes physical. The casing is thick gray plastic, not designed to impress, not designed to be admired from across a room. Designed to survive. Dropped on concrete, sat on in a school bag, left at the bottom of a sports kit for a fortnight, and retrieved without ceremony. There is nothing precious about it. An object you worry about is an object you leave at home. This one you took everywhere because you never had to worry. The D-pad was itself a Yokoi invention. A single piece of plastic on a ball pivot, rocking over 4 contact points, giving a resistance under your thumb that communicated exactly where you were without your eyes leaving the screen. You could navigate a level in the dark. Your thumb learned the language of the thing faster than your brain did. The A and B buttons sat to the right, rubber domes beneath them that compressed and released with a feedback you felt more than heard. Not mushy, not stiff. Calibrated to the pace of a platformer, the rhythm of a puzzle, the sustained reflexes of a child who had been playing for 3 hours and wasn't stopping. And the screen, criticized, limited, technically inferior to everything that would compete with it, turned out to have a property nobody had predicted. It was perfectly readable in direct sunlight. Every backlit color screen of the era washed out in bright conditions, making it useless at the beach, in the car, in the park. The Game Boy's reflective LCD worked best in natural light, which was exactly where the children were. Even the sound, thin and tinny from a small speaker at the lower right, cut through road noise and background conversation at a frequency that carried. You could hear Tetris in a waiting room from 3 seats away. It was not an elegant object, it was the correct one. Every decision made for the place it would actually be used by the person who would actually use it in the conditions they would actually face. Nintendo's marketing team wanted to bundle Super Mario Land with the Game Boy. Mario was Nintendo's identity, looked proven, beloved, a guaranteed draw for every child who owned an NES. The argument for Mario was obvious. Hank Rogers made the argument for Tetris instead. Created by Soviet mathematician Alexei Pajitnov in 1984, Tetris had no characters, no story, no tutorial, and no end. Falling blocks on a grid, the same shapes, endlessly rearranging. Rogers had navigated the Cold War bureaucracy to secure the handheld rights, competing against rivals who wanted them just as badly, and his argument to Nintendo was simple. Tetris wasn't a children's game. It was a game for anyone who had ever needed something to do with their hands. Nintendo made the call and chose Tetris. It sold 35 million copies on Game Boy alone. The decision was quietly revolutionary in a way that only became clear later. Tetris on a Game Boy was the first stock app, the thing already loaded and waiting, requiring no second purchase, no decision, no setup. Like Solitaire on a Windows PC, like Minesweeper on a work computer at lunch. A game so immediate it started before you'd decided to play it, so absorbing it ended long after you'd meant to stop, so perfectly matched to small pockets of dead time that it might as well have been designed for the backseat of a car. The Game Boy gave boredom somewhere to go. Tetris made sure it never arrived in the first place. In 1990, Sega released the Game Gear. Backlit color screen, more powerful hardware, a library of arcade-quality games. On every specification sheet, it was a better machine. It ran for 3 to 5 hours on 6 AA batteries. Atari's Lynx had launched a year earlier. Color, backlit, technically impressive. It also ran for roughly 5 hours and was too large to fit in most children's pockets. Both companies had built for the showroom floor, where a color screen next to a monochrome one was an obvious win. Yokoi had built for the back of a car on a 6-hour drive, where the child with the color screen was staring at a dead device by lunchtime, and the child with the gray brick was still playing. The Game Gear sold around 10 million units, the Lynx 3 million, the Game Boy over 100 million. Yokoi's withered philosophy had beaten superior technology not by being better, but by being right about what mattered. Something shifted in public spaces around 1990 that nobody announced and everybody noticed. Waiting rooms had always been a specific kind of purgatory. Plastic chairs, fluorescent light, a dog-eared magazine from 4 months ago. Airport gates, doctor's offices, the school bus, the co. All of it dead time. Time that existed only to be endured by everyone equally, regardless of age, status, or patience. The Game Boy abolished the equality of boredom. And it didn't just abolish it for children. The businessman at the departure gate, the grandmother on the commuter train, the teenager in the orthodontist's waiting room. Tetris had done what no game before it had managed. It crossed every demographic simultaneously because it asked nothing of you except attention. And attention was the one thing everyone had too much of in a waiting room. A new posture appeared in public spaces and spread until it was everywhere. Head slightly down, shoulders curved inward, both thumbs moving, expression focused and entirely elsewhere. Not passive, not zoned out. Actively engaged, privately in a world no one around them could access. This was the birth of what we might now call the anti-social crouch. The physical signal that a person had left the shared space without moving an inch. What was genuinely new wasn't the escape. The Walkman had invented acoustic escape a decade earlier. What was new was the agency. The Walkman gave you a soundtrack for the world you were still in. The Game Boy replaced the world entirely. You weren't consuming something. You were doing something. Hands, eyes, and mind, working together on a problem that had nothing to do with where your body happened to be sitting. Passive entertainment fills time. Active engagement consumes it. The car pulled into the driveway and you looked up, genuinely surprised that 2 hours had passed. You'd noticed none of it. Dead time hadn't been shortened. It hadn't been sweetened. It had been converted into somewhere else entirely. The Game Boy shipped with a port on the top of the unit. A cable sold separately, the link cable, connected 2 devices for head-to-head play. It was designed for competition. 2 players, 1 cable, each trying to beat the other. Then Pokémon arrived in 1996 and changed what the cable was for. Pokémon required trading creatures between players to complete your collection. You literally could not catch them all alone. The link cable stopped being a way to compete and became a way to collaborate, to negotiate, to build something together that neither player could build separately. On lunch tables and school buses across the world, 2 children sat together, each staring at their own screen, physically connected by a thin wire, conducting transactions of imaginary creatures with the gravity of actual commerce. They were together and entirely separate simultaneously, present with each other, absent from everything around them, building a private economy that only made sense to the 2 of them. The link cable was the Game Boy's accidental social network. Individual screens, brief physical connections, digital objects with no material value, and absolute social currency among the people who understood them. In retrospect, it looks exactly like what came after, the logic of every platform that would follow, 20 years early, running on 4 AA batteries. In the lower left corner of the Game Boy was a small red LED. When the batteries were strong, it glowed steady, a peripheral presence you ignored entirely. When they began to fail, it started to pulse. Slowly at first, then faster, a countdown with no number attached. Every child who owned a Game Boy on a long journey knows the particular cold dread of that light beginning to pulse. The mental arithmetic that followed, how many levels left, whether the next town had a pharmacy, whether it was worth asking to stop and absorbing the parental sigh. The decision to put it down voluntarily before the batteries died on you, to preserve the escape for later, to ration the world you'd found in the gray brick against the hours still remaining. Dead time had been eliminated. And now, the threat of its return and sitting in a moving car with nothing in your hands, nowhere to go in your head, was unbearable in a way it had never been before the Game Boy existed. That's the trade. That's what was given and what was quietly taken in the same transaction. Before, a long drive was uncomfortable. After, a long drive without batteries was something closer to deprivation. We've been managing that trade ever since. In every pocket, on every screen, in every thumb that moves before the mind has decided to move it. The Game Boy family sold 118 million units across its lifespan. Each successor carried the same brief forward, while the original gray brick receded into the background of its own legacy. But the lineage didn't stay inside Nintendo. In the late 1990s, Nokia shipped a game called Snake preloaded on its mobile phones. A single game always there, requiring no cartridge, no purchase, no decision. Sound familiar? A generation of adults who had never owned a Game Boy found themselves hunched over a phone in a waiting room, thumbs moving, the posture identical. The brief had jumped platforms. Then the iPhone arrived in 2007 and the App Store in 2008, and the destination Yokoi had built in gray plastic became infinite. Every micro pocket of time now had 10,000 games competing to fill it. Then social feeds, then short videos, then content streams designed by algorithms to be precisely as long as the gap you happen to be in. The Game Boy had proven there was an appetite. Silicon Valley spent 20 years finding out how deep that appetite actually went. The escalation is visible if you trace it honestly. The Game Boy asked you to look down for 30 minutes on a long drive. Snake asked you to look down for 5 minutes on a commute. The App Store asked you to look down whenever you had 30 seconds. Instagram asked you to look down whenever you had 10. TikTok removed the threshold entirely. Each step is the same brief taken further. More immersive, lower friction, higher frequency, until the destination became so easy to reach that you're already there before you've decided to go. Yokoi's competitors thought the battle was about hardware specifications. They built color screens and lost. The battle was always about the back seat, about the gap between where you are and where your mind needs to be. The Game Boy won that battle so thoroughly that the war itself became the world we live in. Nintendo discontinued the original Game Boy in 2003, 14 years after launch. No announcement worth noting, no retrospective. The color had moved on, the advance had moved further, and the gray brick had simply been superseded by its own children, which would be superseded by theirs. It didn't end so much as recede, each generation carrying the philosophy forward while the original became quietly a relic. The object that had taught a generation that dead time was optional faded from production without anyone marking the moment. There was nothing to mourn exactly because the thing it had started hadn't stopped. The idea never ended. It just evolved. The Game Boy was not a games console. It was the first object that made dead time feel like deprivation. The first thing that trained a generation. In the thumbs, in the reflexes, in the reaching hand, that empty time was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. That the gap between where you are and where your mind wants to be was a gap worth closing. Every time, immediately, with whatever screen was nearest. Before it existed, boredom was uncomfortable but survivable. You waited. You stared out the window. You found something to think about. After it existed, boredom became a different thing entirely. Not discomfort, but deprivation. Not a mood to be waited out, but an absence that demanded to be filled. Every time you pull your phone from your pocket before the elevator doors have closed, that's the Game Boy. Every thumb moving on a surface in a queue, in a pause, in the 30 seconds between one thing and the next. That's the Game Boy. Every app designed to occupy exactly the gap between where you are and where something more interesting is. That's still Yokoi's brief, still being answered, by devices he never lived to see. He watched a bored man press the buttons of a calculator on a train and understood something the rest of the world would spend 30 years catching up to. That empty hands were never going to be acceptable again. Subscribe to support us, and thanks for watching.